The Grand Assembly Hall of Vesidine Prime had never gone silent this fast. One moment, Speaker Orlith Vash was mid-sentence, mocking the human delegation with the practiced cruelty of a diplomat who had never lost an argument in 300 years of service. The next moment, every screen in the chamber turned black, then flooded with a single image, thousands of ships bleeding into existence around the edges of the system, hulls the color of deep space itself, running lightless and silent, visible only because they blotted out the stars behind them. "That," said Ambassador Naomi Osi, folding her hands calmly on the podium, "would be our fleet arriving to collect an apology, or a war, whichever you'd prefer." Speaker Vash's four nostrils flared, the closest his species came to visible panic. "Impossible. Our sensors detect nothing. There is nothing there." "Exactly," Naomi said. "Would you like to keep laughing at us, Speaker? Or would you like to talk?" 3 days earlier, none of this had seemed remotely possible. Aboard the flagship of the Hidden Fleet, a heavy cruiser named the CSV Halcyon, after the very prototype that started it all, Fleet Commander Isaiah Reyes Whitfield watched the tactical plot with a tension he refused to let his crew see on his face. 11,000 ships, folded into dark matter shells, drifting silent through a system that had no idea they existed. One mistake, one flaw in the shielding, one overlooked variable in physics humanity had only mastered a handful of years earlier, and the entire fleet could become visible in an instant, transforming a demonstration of restraint into an act of war nobody back home had authorized. "Status on the shell integrity?" he asked, and his tactical officer, a sharp young woman named Priya Chandrasekaran, didn't look up from her console. "Holding at 98%, sir. But I won't lie to you. We've never held formation this size for this long. If something in that field destabilizes even a few percent, half this fleet becomes visible to every sensor in the system at once." Isaiah nodded slowly. "Then let's make sure the ambassador doesn't need us for very long." Humanity's application to the Galactic Assembly had been denied for the 11th time, and this rejection had been the cruelest yet. The Assembly Chamber, representing over 200 spacefaring civilizations, had gathered specifically to hear humanity's case for membership, and specifically to reject it in the most public, most humiliating fashion the Assembly's ancient customs allowed. Speaker Vash, a Kethari elder whose species had crossed the stars for 11,000 years, had stood before the cameras of a dozen worlds, and called humanity a species of clever animals who mistake noise for achievement. The chamber had laughed, actual laughter, in a dozen alien tongues, echoing off walls built before humans had discovered fire. Ambassador Naomi Osi had stood there and taken it, her jaw tight, her hands steady, because she had been warned this would happen, and she had promised herself she would not give them the satisfaction of a reaction. What the Assembly did not know, what almost no civilization beyond a handful of trusted allies knew, was that humanity had spent the last 40 years pursuing a branch of physics every other species in the galaxy had abandoned as impossible, weaponizing and navigating through dark matter itself. Every major spacefaring civilization used the same handful of technologies, refined over millennia, copied and traded and perfected until propulsion and sensors had become nearly identical across 200 cultures. Humanity, arriving late and mocked for its primitive equipment, had instead asked a different question entirely. Not how do we compete with what already exists, but what has everyone else assumed is impossible. Dr. Kwame Asante had been the one to crack it, in a cramped research station orbiting a dead star nobody else wanted, working with a team of 11 scientists on a budget the Assembly would have considered an insult. Dark matter made up the vast majority of the galaxy's mass, invisible, undetectable by every sensor technology the Assembly's 200 civilizations had ever built, because none of them had ever needed to look for it. Every species that reached the stars did so through technologies that interacted with normal matter, normal light, normal physics. Kwame's team discovered something the Assembly's oldest empires had never even theorized, a way to fold dark matter into a hull, into a drive core, into a weapons array, rendering the resulting vessel not merely stealthy but genuinely, physically undetectable to every sensor suite in known space. But that wasn't even the biggest discovery buried in Kwame's research. The rehook came not from the ships themselves, but from what happened when the first prototype vessel, the CSV Halcyon, was tested near an old mining colony 3 years earlier. The dark matter drive had done something none of the scientists predicted. It had begun to stabilize the gravitational field of a nearby collapsing star, an effect so far beyond anything humanity intended that it took the research team 8 months to understand what their own technology was capable of. Humanity hadn't just built stealth ships. They had accidentally built something that could reshape the fundamental structure of space itself, and they had spent 3 years since then trying to decide, as a species, whether that was a gift or a curse. Naomi had known all of this walking into the assembly chamber. She had known the fleet was already moving into position, hidden and silent, 3 days before the vote was ever called, because human intelligence had predicted the assembly's decision with uncomfortable accuracy. What she hadn't expected was the specific cruelty of Speaker Vash's closing remarks, delivered with a smile that had clearly been rehearsed. Perhaps, Vash had said, when your species has existed for another 10,000 years, you will have earned the right to sit among civilizations, rather than beg at their door. The chamber had laughed again, and this time, Naomi had allowed herself exactly 3 seconds of silence before answering. You're right that we're young, Speaker, but you've made a mistake tonight that older, wiser species learned to avoid a long time ago. And what mistake is that, Ambassador? You assumed that because you couldn't see something, it wasn't there. That was when the screens went black, and the fleet appeared. What followed was not the massacre the more paranoid members of the assembly braced for, and that in itself became the twist nobody in the chamber expected. Naomi had not brought the fleet to conquer, and she had not brought it merely to intimidate. She had brought it to prove a single point that humanity's diplomatic corps had argued about for months before the vote. Respect could not be requested, only demonstrated, and demonstration did not require violence. Stand down weapons, she said quietly into a private channel, and across a formation of 11,000 vessels, not a single railgun or torpedo tube ever charged. The fleet simply existed, silent and undeniable, a physical fact the assembly could no longer pretend away. Speaker Vash's aide, a young Cathari diplomat named Threl Osa, who had spent the entire session watching Naomi rather than his own speaker, finally spoke up from the back of the chamber, his voice shaking. Ambassador Ose, if your fleet has been capable of this for years, why did you never use it before? Why endure 11 rejections, 11 years of mockery, when you could have forced this outcome from the beginning? It was the question Naomi had been waiting for someone to ask. Because forcing you to accept us isn't the same as earning your respect, and my people decided a long time ago that we would rather be patient and right than fast and wrong. We didn't bring this fleet tonight to threaten you into a vote. We brought it because Speaker Vash told the galaxy that humanity had nothing worth fearing or respecting, and we thought the assembly deserved to see the truth before making that claim permanent in the historical record. Speaker Vash, to his credit, did not double down the way Naomi expected. His nostrils flared again, but this time it wasn't panic. It was the specific, uncomfortable recalculation of a diplomat realizing he had misjudged an opponent badly enough to threaten his own legacy. You could destroy this entire station without a single ship of ours ever detecting the attack, he said slowly, and yet you haven't. No, Naomi agreed. We haven't, and we're not going to. That's the part I need you to understand, Speaker, because it's the only part that actually matters tonight. The chamber, which had been laughing less than 10 minutes earlier, now sat in a silence so complete that the hum of the station's own life support systems became audible for the first time in living memory. Somewhere behind the delegates, an elderly Voss representative who had served the assembly for over 2 centuries leaned toward her aide and murmured, so quietly only he could hear it, that she had never once in all her years witnessed a species choose mercy while holding every advantage. She did not know yet that her whispered words would be repeated in assembly histories for generations to come, but the crisis wasn't over yet, And the next twist arrived from a place nobody in the chamber expected. Midway through the standoff, a private channel opened on Isaiah's console aboard the Halcyon, and Priya's voice came through tight with alarm. "Sir, we have a problem. One of the older assembly cruisers just powered up a scanning array we've never cataloged before. Experimental tech, not in any of our databases. If it's what I think it is, it might actually be able to see through the dark matter shell." Isaiah felt his stomach drop. Time to detection? 90 seconds, maybe less. For the first time since the fleet had gone dark 3 days earlier, Isaiah faced a choice with no good answer. Reveal the fleet himself, on his own authority, and risk igniting the very war Naomi was trying to prevent, or stay hidden and gamble that the scan would fail, potentially leaving his entire fleet exposed and vulnerable in the heart of enemy territory. He chose to trust the ambassador. "Hold position. Don't so much as breathe wrong, Lieutenant." The 90 seconds that followed were the longest of Priya's career. When the experimental scanner finally cycled through its sweep, and returned nothing, the bridge crew allowed themselves exactly one collective breath before returning to absolute silence, because they all understood now that they had come within a minute and a half of catastrophe without anyone in the assembly chamber ever knowing how close they'd come. The debate that followed lasted 6 hours, and it was not the debate anyone had prepared for. Delegates who had spent the earlier session mocking humanity's primitive engines now found themselves asking increasingly urgent questions about dark matter physics, about the stabilization effect near the dying star, about what humanity intended to do with a technology capable of reshaping stellar bodies. Naomi answered every question honestly, including the ones that made her own government uncomfortable, because she had argued from the beginning that honesty was the only foundation humanity could build a real alliance on. When a delegate from the Aquatic Vase Collective asked bluntly whether humanity intended to use the stabilization effect as a weapon against uncooperative species, Naomi did not deflect. "We could, we've chosen not to, and I want to be honest with you. That choice gets harder to defend to our own people every single day. This assembly treats us like animals instead of neighbors." It was Threl Osa, the young aide, who cast the first vote to reverse the rejection, breaking 20 years of protocol that required junior diplomats to vote in lockstep with their speaker. When Speaker Vash turned to him in visible shock, Threl simply said, "You taught me that respect is earned through strength, Speaker. Tonight I watched a species with more strength than any of us have ever possessed. Choose not to use it. I don't know what that's worth in the old ways, but I know what it's worth to me." One by one, delegation after delegation followed, not out of fear of the silent fleet still holding position beyond the system's edge, but out of something none of them expected to feel toward humanity that night: genuine, hard-earned respect. The final vote came just before dawn on Vesidine Prime, and it passed by the widest margin in the Assembly's recorded history. Speaker Vash, humbled but not broken, was the one who formally welcomed humanity into the Galactic Assembly, his earlier mockery never mentioned again by anyone in the chamber, though everyone in that room would remember it for the rest of their lives. Naomi Sosei stood at the podium one final time, watching the dark matter fleet begin its silent withdrawal from the system, ships that had never fired a single shot, never needed to. "You called us clever animals who mistake noise for achievement," she said. "I hope tonight taught you that the loudest thing in this galaxy was never our ships, it was our patience. Remember that the next time you're tempted to mistake silence for weakness."